Alright, Langston Hughes, today we're going to talk about the characteristics of functions. The first characteristic that we're going to talk about is domain. Our domain looks at how far across the x-axis our graph stretches. Alright, so if we look here, here's my x-axis. Alright, and we want to decide how far across this graph, how far across the coordinate plane this graph crosses. If we look at this graph, the first thing we have to decide is what type of graph do we have. And as you can see, this graph goes off the edge of the coordinate plane, which makes it a continuous graph. Since it's a continuous graph, as this graph continues to go across this way, it's approaching x in a negative infinity direction. As it continues to go across this way, it's approaching x in a positive infinity direction. Therefore, my domain is going to be negative infinity to positive infinity. Next, we're going to look at where our graph, we're going to look at our range. Our range looks at how high and how low the graph will go on the coordinate plane according to the y-axis. So here is our y-axis. Our y-axis goes up and down. Alright? So, again, we have a continuous graph, which tells me that if this graph continues to go down in this direction, it's approaching negative infinity. As if it continues to go up, it's approaching positive infinity. So my range for this particular graph is going to be negative infinity to positive infinity. Alright? Since we have a continuous graph, we're going to have a local maximum point and a local minimum point for this particular graph. When I look at this graph, the maximum point on this graph before it decides to go into infinity is going to be here. So the local maximum that I'm going to have is 3. And I'm only paying attention to my y-axis to decide my local maximum point. For my local minimum point, the lowest point that it's going to reach before it goes into infinity is going to be -1. Alright? My zeros, another characteristic, are also what we call our x-intercepts. Alright? So we're trying to figure out where does this graph cross the x-axis. This graph ends up crossing the x-axis in several different points. Well, let's circle them. The graph crosses the x-axis the very first time at -4. It crosses another time at 0. And it crosses another time at +3. Alright? If we were to write these as points, how do I get to this point here? I go over to -4 and I stay at 0. So my first 0 is -4, 0. My second 0 is right on my origin at 0, 0. My third 0 is at 3, 0. Those are all my zeros, are my x-intercepts. Now I want to find my y-intercepts. My y-intercepts are very similar to my x-intercepts. This is where the graph is going to cross my y-axis. Remember, my y-axis goes up and down, alright? And it just so happens that my x-intercept and my y-intercept are exactly the same. It crosses at my origin at 0, 0. Alright, now let's look at my intervals of increase and decrease. Intervals of increase and decrease only looks at my x-axis. So I only want to pay attention to what the graph does according to my x-axis. We're going to look at intervals of increase and decrease from left to right. Alright? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to trace our finger from where the graph starts on the left, and notice it's going up. And we're going to draw a line where the graph changed direction. It started out going up, and then it changes directions here, and it starts going down. I trace my finger down, and I'm going to place another line because the graph is going to change direction again. Okay? Since this graph is continuous, I know that my x's over here are approaching negative infinity, and my x's over here are approaching positive infinity. So, if I'm tracing my finger up from left to right and I'm trying to decide where this graph is coming from, it's coming from negative infinity. It's coming from negative infinity, it's increasing from negative infinity, and it changes directions here. And again, remember, I don't want to look at my y-axis, I only want to look at my x-axis. When I look at my x-axis, it increases till it gets to negative 3 here. So my first interval of increase is going to be negative infinity to negative 3. All right? Then it changes directions. Once it changes directions, it starts decreasing. It decreases from negative 3, where we were just then, until we get to this point. And again, remember, I'm looking at my x-axis. When I look at my x-axis, it decreases till it gets to positive 1. So my first interval of decrease is going to be from this negative 3, where I started here, to positive 1. All right? Then it changed directions on me again, and it decided to increase again. And it increases from positive 1 till I get to positive infinity. This is going to be 2 levels of increase. So we're going to do a union, a symbol for union, and it's going to increase from positive 1 to positive infinity. All right? Those are just several characteristics of functions.